Welcome to People's Republic with Brian Griffith. We bring you news and analysis from the front lines of the global struggle for social and economic justice. I'm your host, Brian Griffith, and here's what's going down this week in your backyard and across the world. Welcome to People's Republic. This is, of course, Brian Griffith. We are joined today by Dr. Greg Shupak, professor of media studies at the University of Guelph in Toronto, as well as the author of The Wrong Story, Israel, Palestine, and the Media, available on the OR Books website. We're going to be talking, starting with the firing of Marc Lamont Hill from CNN based on some comments on Palestine, which appear to not actually be controversial comments, as best I can tell. And then we're, just going to talk about sort of the state of pro-Palestinian struggle in general and sort of the discourse around that. So thank you, Dr. Shupak, for joining the show once again.
Thanks for having me.
So let's talk first about, basically who Marc Lamont Hill is, sort of what it was he actually said about Israel, Palestine, and is this actually controversial? Is this should this be fireable? I think we both kind of know the answer to that, and what sort of has the takeaway been?
Okay, so Temple University, and up until the end of last week was a commentator for CNN. He gave a speech at the United Nations on the International Day for Palestinian Solidarity. And in that speech, the phrase that supporters of Israel seized on was his statement that Palestine will be free from the river to the sea. So the phrase "from the river to the sea" is, I guess, people got him in trouble over and got him fired over. So what does "from the river to the sea" mean? It means from the River Jordan to the Mediterranean Sea. Specifically, he's talking about all of historic Palestine. That is what is now called Israel, plus Gaza and the West Bank. So when he says "from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free," some rather disingenuous supporters of Israel have said, what that is code for is basically kill all Jewish people living in historic Palestine, including Israel. They suggest that it's a call for genocide, even. So that, as I said, incredibly disingenuous. What Hill says, and what I think is much more persuasive, is that he's advocating a single democratic secular state in which both Palestinians and Israelis live throughout all of historic Palestine. So, in other words, what he's saying, he thinks the best way to resolve the question of Palestine is through a single state, the one-state solution. This is in contrast with the two-state solution that that many governments around the world advocate, and also various people in Palestine, Israel. So the idea of one state would be, as my remarks a moment ago suggested, that everyone in Israel, the West Bank, and Gaza lives. It's all one country, and everybody there lives equally. In other words, the apparatus that has been erected, which gives Israeli citizens special rights over Palestinians who live inside of the 1948 armistice lines, what is called Israel. And it would also mean, therefore, an end to the occupation of the West Bank and the occupation and siege on Gaza. So really what he's endorsing is he's saying, instead of solving the question of Palestine-Israel by ethnic partition, in which Palestinians have depending on what model you go by, a maximum of maybe 27% of historic Palestine. At this point, a lot of that 27% has been gobbled up through Israeli settlements. It's very much discontiguous because of and the infrastructure supporting the settlements, i.e. Jewish-only roads, settler-only roads, checkpoints, and so forth. So a lot of the advocates of the one-state solution say not only is it more just, but it's also more practical, because in order to create a two-state solution, you have to evacuate the hundreds of thousands of Israeli settlers living in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem. And that obviously is a monumental undertaking that would probably involve a lot of bloodshed being spilled by the settlers. That is to say, they would not go peacefully. The notion of the one-state solution is just based on the simple principle of one person, one vote, of binationalism. In other words, Jewish and non-Jewish people are equal. And there's no scenario like right now where, for example, take, say, Jerusalem. There's a law saying, an Israeli law saying, the city of Jerusalem has to be more than three quarters Jewish. There's not these sort of arbitrary state laws in place anymore under a one-state solution. There's not laws like the current one where the Israeli state deems to be Jewish from around the world can automatically become an Israeli citizen on one hand and can live there, and Palestinian refugees are not allowed to return to their homes. All of these and other similar needed if a one-state solution was to be put in place. So, and I mean, we know from Hill's record, there's nothing in the years of work that he's done that would suggest, frankly, anything than a strong commitment to anti-racism. What it is just an attempt to stifle dissent about Israel because it happened to crop up from somebody in a prominent position. And now we see that there are calls to get him fired from his job at Temple University. Some people in university are supporting that. So we see instances much like we saw with Stephen Saleta, for example, his tenured position because of tweets critical of Israel that he made while Israel was in the process of a slaughter of 2,200 Palestinians in 51 days in the summer of 2014. So this is about discourse management.
I want to get into maybe a little bit more about kind of the way Americans tend to view Israel, Palestine, and this whole two-state solution thing. So I think so much of the traditional way that Americans have seen Israel, or at least in the past few decades, has been under the sort of discourse of a quote unquote what we might consider a safe space or something. That is to say that it's obvious that there is anti-Semitism throughout the world, and that sort of the narrative that's permeated was that Israel was set up as a what we would today consider like a safe space for Jews fleeing anti-Semitism. But in fact, I think as more and more people are seeing, the kind of internal logic that guides the Israeli state is far more of a settler colonial project. That is to say that, to me, what holds together the kind of logic of the Israeli state is this kind of concept of it is, to me, in some degree, a concept of whiteness, as kind of problematic as the discourse around Judaism and whiteness can tend to be. But in fact, the way Israel has as we were talking about these separate laws for Jews, for specifically for settlers, because they define who is kind of Jewish enough to be a citizen of this Israeli state very narrowly as well. The other kind of internal logic that's driving this colonization of more and more land is, in fact, entirely just a settler colonial project. Like, do you think there's sort of a change in the way people are seeing this, or is it? Obviously, we still have a lot of work to do around kind of exposing the Israeli state, but I feel like in many ways, Americans' views of this have changed a lot in the past few years, at very least.
Yeah, and before I get to that, if you don't mind, I'll just comment more point about what you said regarding the from the river to the sea. That's been a sort of talking point of people who want want Marc Lamont Hill, or those who encourage his firing from CN, is they say, well, this is a Hamas slogan. I mean, the slogan has been around longer than it is a slogan for justice in the ways that I explained in the first parts of this discussion. And as to your question, to tie the two issues together, I think that there have indeed been shifts in the American on Palestine, Israel. However, it is still the case that you would not see people getting fired for the type of thing that Hill was just fired for. In fact, it's really difficult to imagine somebody getting fired from a major U.S. news network or U.S. university or a Canadian matter for saying really anything anti-Palestinian, much less something that at worst is ambiguous, like from the river to the sea. But I assert that it's not ambiguous and is frankly clear justice. But my point here is that although there has been some modifications in the climate, I think it's nevertheless true that you can say virtually anything anti-Palestinian that you want, and your job will not be, if your job's in media or academia.
You know, in so many ways, the game was kind of given away by the fact that the Israeli state has armed, for instance, we're talking literal Nazis in Ukraine. I know that the word Nazi is kind of thrown around, but in fact, the kind of Ukrainian government, such as specifically kind of these paramilitaries, such as the Azov Battalion, but also people within the Ukrainian government are openly espousing Nazism, and much of their weaponry has come from Israel. This has been a kind of big business for them. And so you see kind of the alignment also with so much of the Israeli state with the project of Donald Trump and whatnot. And I feel like, that really, really does give the game away that in many ways, Israel is as anti-Semitic a state as almost any out there.
Yes, this is a good point that I meant to get to in my last reply. Yeah, I mean, look, it's at this point the veil has been lifted. It's pretty clear that the existence of Israel is not something that protect Jewish people, because precisely as you say, they have deep relations with flagrantly Nazi groups in Ukraine, including selling them arms. They're also rather cozy with Viktor Orban. And we can go back. This goes back further. In the 80s, they were the 70s and 80s Argentine military junta that had proto-Nazi elements. This is not even a particularly new development. Israel is not, contrary to its claims, the state of the Jewish people. For one thing, there's not been some kind of worldwide referendum of Jewish people who endorsed giving Israel that title. Most Jewish people on earth do not live in Israel, so they have the option of doing so according to Israeli law. But furthermore, as you suggested, remember that Israel doesn't necessarily have a immaculate record, that there's very much a hierarchy among Jewish people in Israel, and Zionism has always been a problem for the Ashkenazi, the Jewish people coming from Western Europe and also more recently North America, specifically the United States. So I think that all of these contradictions really give this notion that Israel is sort of the insurance policy of the Jewish people against another Holocaust. A lot of realpolitik, and we see a lot of internal racism that is directed not only, of course, at Palestinians, but also at Jewish people that they deem to be, the ruling elite of Israel, that is deemed to be inferior.
One of the things that I feel needs mentioning is kind of what I believe to be a reversal in people's minds of kind of the power dynamics of who actually is controlling the narrative on Israel Palestine within the U.S. So I think there's to be more specific about it, there's this kind of a mindset that some people have that the Israel lobby is the most kind of influential sort of influence on people's thought processes within the U.S. There's this idea that Israel or whatnot controls the media. And I think to some degree, that's a reversal of the real power politics of settler colonialism, where in fact Israel is a project very much driven by the United States. And I think that's where there is a very legitimate issue of kind of anti-Semitism, not so much in the sort of pro-Palestinian resistance, but in fact, by trying to project all this settler colonialism onto Israel, instead of seeing Israel itself as kind of a larger outgrowth and even sort of an outpost for kind of U.S. control over the region, I think that veers into a different kind of territory, and I want to get people to start thinking about that in terms of like, well, is it really the Israeli lobby that's controlling the U.S. media, or does in fact the U.S. media as kind of the mouthpiece of U.S. imperial control, is it in fact that's simply their part of that their wider agenda, as well as understanding that kind of the settler colonial project remains kind of strongest within the U.S. right now?
Yeah, I agree that I think the role of the so-called Israel lobby is often very much exaggerated in terms of how it shapes U.S. policy, certainly, and also discourse in the U.S. or in Canada or other Western countries, Britain as well. Look, there is a pro-Israel lobby. It does have a lot of money. Much of that money, if the vast majority of it, in fact, comes from the broader right front of the United States. So in this regard, the Koch brothers fund pro-Israel organizations, but they also fund like pro-fracking organizations. The pro-Israel lobby is just one element forces in the United States. It's not some unique standalone. It's part of the colonialism and imperialism and capitalism. And I imagine it sometimes has an effect. They probably wouldn't, people wouldn't spend so many millions of dollars on it. On the other hand, we can think of plenty of instances that achieve its aims because those run up against those of U.S. imperialism. To give a recent one, when Obama signed the what's called the Iran nuclear deal, this was a strategy for kind of dominating and weakening Iran, subjecting it to all these forms of sort of international management and so also some sanctions. But the Israeli government and the Israel lobby in the United States wanted a different. So there was this division within the U.S. ruling class between basically roughly to manage Iran and dominate Iran through the nuclear accord, and others wanting to confront it in the short term with more immediately bellicose posture. So that was its preferred approach for dealing with what they see as the Iran problem. Netanyahu kicked and screamed. It didn't matter that AIPAC did the same. And there's many other examples of that. It's true that you can't go on TV and, well, certainly can't go on TV and say from the river to the sea, because apparently you can't even be a guy who says that somewhere else and then later goes on TV. But there's a lot of things you can't say on TV as well. So you can, likelihood, go on TV and talk about sort of like, North Korea's need to defend itself from U.S. imperialist aggression, or the achievements of the Cuban Revolution. There's all kinds of things that basically are not permitted to be aired in Western and particularly American media. And I don't think I don't think you'd find too many saying that my North Korea example is determined by entirely or mainly by hawkish South Korean lobby groups in the United States. I think very much we can find a more satisfactory explanation by looking at when we look at the same lens. Israel has carried out mercenary work for the United States during the Cold War, and when the U.S. Congress eventually, finally, belatedly passed laws saying that the United States, the Contras or some of the murderous military regimes in Central America, one way they dealt with that was they just said, okay, fine, we'll give Israel and have them deliver the arms for us. We'll just triangulate in that regard. They had Israel assassinate leftists in numerous African countries, in East Asia. Israel's service as a proxy is the main reason that America wants to both concomitantly stifle criticism of it to the greatest degree possible, to really constrain that criticism. For the same reason that criticism of capitalism is very Palestinian liberation is a threat to the U.S. ruling class, in the same way that it would be a threat for somebody to go on CNN or MSNBC or whatever and talk about only being able to achieve justice when they control the means of production. It's too direct of a challenge to the very ruling class that the media itself is a part of to give such perspectives much airtime.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree more with that. We're going to go ahead and wrap it up. We've been speaking with Dr. Greg Shupak, who is a professor of media studies at the University of Guelph in Toronto, as well as the author of The Wrong Story, Israel, Palestine, and the Media, which is available on the OR Books website for purchase now. And I apologize for some of the internet problems there. Speaking of other threats to the ruling class, apparently me having a decent internet connection is enough of a threat to the ruling class that they have conspired against me to prevent me from getting that today. Dr. Shupak, thank you very much for joining us again.
Thanks for having me.
You are listening to People's Republic with Brian Griffith. People's Republic originates on KOOP in Austin and is also broadcast on WHIV in New Orleans. We are also available as a podcast on Spotify, SoundCloud, Spreaker, Stitcher, iTunes, or wherever podcasts are podded. Just go to your podcasting app of choice and type in People's Republic to find all of our episodes. Thank you very much and stay tuned. Welcome back to People's Republic with Brian Griffith. I, of course, am Brian Griffith, and this week we are going to hear from the Luqmans. This interview was recorded a few weeks back, and it is about the rise of the far right. I think it is as pertinent today as it was when we recorded it, and we hope to have the Luqmans again on the show soon. You can also hear them. They now have a regular segment on Loud and Clear on Radio Sputnik, so if you're not familiar with that show, I definitely think there's some very interesting kind of news and commentary there, featuring Jacqueline and Abdus Luqman of Luqman Nation, as well as so many other wonderful guests, bringing a variety of political perspectives, by and large, real, kind of hard-hitting left-wing analysis of the issues affecting the world around us. We're gonna hear from the Luqmans. This is about the rise of the far right in Brazil, and we will have them on again hopefully soon, later than January. The far-right candidate Bolsonaro has just surged to victory in Brazil, now putting the future of the Amazon in jeopardy and certainly spelling grave danger for Black and indigenous Brazilians. Meanwhile, a rash of far-right hate crimes has once again plagued the U.S., as well as we're also going to talk about the Trump militarization of the border. What can be done? What can we expect out of a right-wing dominated Brazil? And what can the left do to better prepare itself for what seems to be a continuing global far right onslaught. So joining us to talk about this are Jackie and Abdus Luqman, the co-hosts of Luqman Nation. Thank you both for coming on.
Oh, it's a pleasure.
Thank you.
Let's start first of all with the Brazil thing, though, with Bolsonaro, and just the guy is basically just an open fascist, right? I feel like that term is bandied about, is sort of thrown around so much for people like Trump, and they're these sort of proto-fascist figures that have all the sort of characteristics of fascist figures. But Bolsonaro, I believe, is sort of openly said as much that Pinochet should have gone farther, et cetera, et cetera. So there's like no, this is, if Trump was the mask ripped off what neoliberalism is, I feel like this is just the mask ripped off of that to reveal, actually there is fascism underneath. How do you feel about Bolsonaro and what that is?
The whole rise of Bolsonaro in Brazil really speaks to the whole global push of the rise of the fascist alt-right. And I think it speaks to the failure on the left to take the alt-right seriously when it first began to express itself publicly, right? Like in some countries, there's always been like the fringes of what was left of the Nazi movement, of fascist movements, especially, we always automatically think of Germany. And they've always had an issue with neo-Nazis and, small pockets of fascists trying to resurrect the Reich. And we've limited that to Germany, and we've kind of ignored the similar kinds of movements that have not just sprung up in other countries, but we've ignored the history, the connective history between the fall of the Third Reich and the rise of fascist groups or fascist politicians in other countries. Because what's true is that not all Nazis were captured and imprisoned or executed after the war. A lot of them escaped, and a lot of them went to countries like Brazil. So those people continued their pursuit of power, but in really quiet ways. They played the long game. They got involved in politics, or they financed politicians. They had little secret societies, and they groomed politicians, and they went under the radar, and people might have laughed and joked at them. And that's how you get a Bolsonaro.
How much of this, this like failure of kind of the left to envision a better future is possibly, how much of that kind of plays into this kind of rise of the far right? Because I feel like so much of the left right now is contracting right now, and it's kind of political vision of we need to protect the gains we have at any cost. We need to protect this kind of a tepid social democracy, when really I think what the working class needs, what will really inspire people in so many ways, is to in fact expand what we believe to be possible, to actually have a vision, a platform, a something there that is a better world other than what we just have to defend. We just have to win this election cycle over and over and over again.
Yeah, from what I understand, and I don't know a whole lot about the Brazilian political climate before like the past maybe 10 years, but from what I understand, the Workers' Party in Brazil didn't really make that many gains when they had power. And part of it is because of corruption, but part of it also, and we've always looked at Brazil here in Luqman Nation from the context of being like the country with the largest population of African descended people. Is it in the Western Hemisphere or in the world? Outside of Africa itself.
And it's the largest population of African descended people in the world.
Yeah, outside of Africa itself. So the population of African descended people or Afro-Brazilian people have been under the same kind of police state oppression and political disenfranchisement that we are fighting against here, but on steroids. And the Working Party when it had power, didn't do a lot to really focus on that group of people, to really change anything for them, to make their situation better. And it reminds me of the Democratic Party here in this country, where you've got this loyal voter base that you do nothing for. So then this group of people can't strengthen your party, so that you end up having these anemic, weak, shallow policies when you have power. And that just makes it easier for the other party to come in and undo the little bit of gains that you did. And I think that's very much part of what happened in Brazil.
Well, I also wanted to add to that is the fact that I think that the problem with the left in Brazil is the same problem with the left in America, and it's the same problem with the left in Spain and in other places where there is some measures of prosperity. But then you have a large part of the population which isn't experiencing that type of prosperity. I think that in segregated societies like Brazil, segregated societies like the United States, and when you have a liberal left that is basically ran by elites that don't reach out to those who are way below the margins economically. We see that here in the United States, where even though those who claim to be liberal don't really feel like they have anything in common with those who they claim to want to fight for. There's definitely not really a major effort to reach out to those people. And we see the same thing. I see the same thing in Brazil. I think the reason why fascism has basically gained such a hold in Brazil, not only because of its history, and we know, as Jackie has stated earlier, that the history of fascism in Brazil goes back where the Nazis, Nazi sympathizers even had slaves on at certain parts. So that runs deep. And we also understand that all of these movements are economic in nature. You know, where you have a large part of the elites who, Brian, I think you had stated this, wants to really hold on to what they have, and they want to gain even more. And so a lot of this is expressed in the fact. I mean, I was just reading what this guy, the new Brazilian president, Bolsonaro. I mean, some of the things he said. I mean, he wants criminals to be summarily shot rather than face trial. He called indigenous people parasites. I mean, you know, and he talked about eugenically devising forms of birth control. And he warned about the danger posed by refugees from Haiti, Africa, and the Middle East, calling them the scum of humanity. Now, that's very, very harsh language. But it's also what we heard here, not maybe in those terms, but it's also what we heard here. So I think that the failure of the left to confront these things is the fact that the left hasn't successfully galvanized it's what I should say, its army, which includes a lot of dark, black, poor people, which a lot of these left movements are really ran by white liberals,
right?
Who still fail to reach out and organize with the black and brown people in these areas.
Yeah, I think really that says so much that really it's an absolute domination of that kind of capitalist class that I don't think is in many ways trying to draw that distinction between the left and liberalism when there's so much kind of overlap of kind of ideologies as people sort of go from this more wishy-washy liberalism to an actual leftism. And I think we're seeing that start to emerge here in the U.S. to some degree of people really having to define where it is they are. Like, people are getting there. People are certainly more conscious overall now in 2018 than during the kind of 2016 or even going back to 2014 elections. But I think there's so much lacking in kind of American left movements, and at the same time we've seen kind of the normalization of Trumpism has gone from an anomaly to essentially the kind of only game in town that can win for that for kind of rightist conservative movements as the center falls apart. And I just wonder, looking at elections here, I don't see, this may seem like a hard pivot, but I don't think it is, because we're talking about the rise of the far right in two countries here. I don't see where there's an American, at least not this electoral left, in place at the moment, given kind of the infrastructure of the Democratic Party. I don't see it really being this blue wave. I don't see, I think in a lot of these races that people think are going to be so progressive, I think these kind of like pseudo progressive candidates are just going to get steamrolled, because I feel like some of them, have drifted more toward the left on, or more toward like, broad popular policies on healthcare or whatnot. But there's not, even within the kind of the so-called democratic socialist movement, I don't see where the strong kind of vision for society beyond, simply getting people healthcare is. And and there's certainly not that kind of we're not talking about things in terms of like racial liberation yet, or in terms of trans liberation yet. And I think that's where that's going to have to go. I think, instead of this kind of contracting of the political vision, and instead of these kind of like half measures between what used to be the kind of neoliberal center, which is completely collapsed at this point, but has sort of like tried to co-opt these movements. I think that, the kind of Bernie Sanders wing or whatnot. But I don't think it's going to convince people. I don't think, between that and the kind of voter suppression efforts, mostly led by Republicans, but that the Democrats have refused to kind of fight against, I don't see a blue wave happening. And I think the left still has so much to learn about how, how this kind of class struggle plays out. For so many people who are just now recognizing class, they need to kind of see beyond class and into how these organizing structures really look.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's exactly right. I mean, I think in the upcoming midterms, as far as how it's going to play out, I mean, obviously the GOP is going to hold the Senate. They're not going to lose. I don't think they're going to lose too many seats, but they might lose one or two, but they're not going to lose enough to lose control of the Senate. I do think the Democrats will regain control of the House. But there are two races that are so close that shouldn't be. And it's precisely because of the things we're talking about. I mean, we have two just flat out, well, not just two, but particularly in Georgia and in Florida, two just flat out racists who are running for governor, who honestly should not be in races as close as they are with their Democratic challengers. But the Democrats' vision for policies that people are supposed to be supporting and excited about aren't that exciting. And these arguments aren't even difficult to make, right? Like it's not difficult to make the argument that if we make sure the least in this society, regardless of who you think the least are, but let's be clear, the least in this society are Black people and historically have been. If we make sure the least in this society have not just equality of opportunity, but are made whole economically, and as far as everything else that has been disenfranchised of them, then you win too. And this is how. These are not difficult arguments to make, but the Democrats won't make them because they don't want to turn off white voters who they know are racists. And they just want these people's votes. They don't want to actually address the problem. They really just want to win the next election. So even if the Democrats gain the House, as far as actually moving this society toward more left policies, the Democrats aren't going to be the ones to do it because they haven't done it. Like you said, they've operated from purely a very far right neoliberal, typical liberal light ideology. that is very appealing. Well, it was very appealing to moderate Republicans, and that's why it was designed that way. Third way democratic policy, but those policies did nothing for actual liberation and equality, social equality and economic equality of people, of groups of people in this country. And the only way we're going to do that is if we understand what it is we're fighting and we face what it is we're fighting. We're not fighting a president. We're not supporting a political party. We're not opposing a political party. We're fighting a system of white supremacy, neoliberalism, and oppression that has global implications. So we can't just look at what Trump is doing in this country. We can't just look at domestic policy. We have to see how it all connects. And that's very daunting for a lot of people. That's almost frightening for a lot of people. And I completely understand that, but people really need to, and those of us who are on the left outside of the Democratic Party, that's why we're so insistent, because we understand that people just need to put their big pants on and just get in there and fight, because there is no time left. This election in Brazil, if that does not prove to people how little time we have left to fight this rising tide of fascism, I don't know what else will. Maybe in a couple of years, Germany falling to the same fate, because that's where Steve Bannon's going next.
Yeah. I absolutely agree. We just heard the other day that Merkel will be stepping down in a few years, and at that point, the Merkel kind of coalition in Germany, of course, has been on the fritz for a while. It's been kind of breaking down for a while, and yeah, it looks like the sort of the surging force there is going to be the so-called Alternative for Deutschland, which is another far right, essentially white supremacist party. So it's definitely I more and more people need to think of what sort of like vision what sort of vision we need to have that can kind of counter this, because I find one of the most absolutely disgusting, shameful takes that's come out of the couple of white supremacist attacks, the shooting up of the synagogue, and I believe there was a Kroger shooting as well, where essentially I believe black people were essentially targeted at random.
Yeah.
And so there have been these white supremacist hate crimes, and one of the most shameful takes on this that I have seen is that the people using "this is why we need to vote, our lives are at stake," and I can't.
It's like, I mean, I think we've been, Abdus and I have been watching the news over the past couple of days, and while we are sympathetic to people's horror, right, and I don't want to dismiss people's horror, because these are horrible things. At the same time, we've always said, but this has been our existence in this country since we've existed in this country. And we've been trying to tell you this, but you've ignored us. So now it's happening like to you. You're seeing it all the time. But people are still like, oh my God, how could this happen? We need to vote to stop these things. Black people have been voting since we've pretty much had the right to vote. I mean, and we've still been getting massacred, and we've still been disenfranchised, and we've still been lynched. So we're not discounting the need to vote. What we're saying is that these people who are focusing on voting as the answer to the system of white supremacy clearly don't understand white supremacy.
Yeah, I can't imagine. Go ahead.
No, I was just saying that, I mean, nothing's really changed here. I think, we have the 24-hour news cycle. So we're much, we're a lot more quicker about these type of events than probably before. But I think that social media is actually serving the role that television has served on the civil rights movement. When black people were being brutalized down south, and it was the TV cameras that basically exposed this stuff. to not only other Americans, but to the rest of the world, and basically kind of forced the country to deal with it on some level. I think that social media is playing the same role, except like we got to look at the similarities too between the two. In the South, you had this brazen racial attacks under the cover of political protection. So, so you had the mayors, you had everybody else who was in positions of authority, basically turning a blind eye to it and actually fueling the fire through their rhetoric of inflaming racist passions within a segment of the population. And we see that happening today. And we see that they call it dog whistles or whatever they want to call it, but it is exactly the same type of hateful rhetoric that's being spewed by these politicians. And let's look at it now. Now there's a new, well, not so much new, but there's a different player in this game, which is conservative radio.
True.
That is, people are constantly listening to all the time, which is also inflaming the same racialized, homophobic, xenophobic, racist passions in these people. And some folks could, listen to it and, but now, you got people who are going up and committing violence. And then you got it all the way down at the other end of the spectrum where a woman said that she had to just let off steam by leaving a racist note. Mm-hmm. All of it still is under terrorism, in my view, whether it's at the point of a gun or that you just won't leave folks alone. You feel like you have to put a letter there to let them know how you feel about them, your racism.
How much you hate them.
Yeah, how much you hate them. So, but I think your earlier question about the left and why it seems that the left have a hard time, because I agree with you, Brian. I don't think that there's going to be this blue wave that everyone's talking about. I think that the country is polarized so much that I don't see really a blue wave. But I also think that the failure of the left to really be an effective force against these things has a lot to do with the message. Mm-hmm. And I don't think that the left has really because that's one thing that the right has. They have a message, and of course we don't agree with that message, but they have a message and they don't really alternate from that.
Right.
And I think that the left, one of the things that the left has a problem with is messaging, and hasn't really done well with that.
Yeah, and I think part of that also, I don't want to kind of blame like sort of this nebulous left, because understanding that like the left is 1,000 different things that sort of coalesce into we could break down what exactly we mean when we're talking about the left, but if we look at kind of history of the U.S., it's not that for instance sort of the movements of the 60s and 70s, the real powerful communist movements, the Black Panthers and all that good stuff, the anti-war movement. It's not that those just went away, that people stopped caring. It's that those were suppressed by those that represented the largest threats to the status quo. Those were actively suppressed. Those leaders were assassinated. That was
right.
So like understanding that a lot of what we're left with the left is or at least for many decades, the people who could kind of stay within these institutional powers without bumping up against anyone too much, with the kind of Chomsky type academic leftist for whom the entire thing's just like an intellectual exercise. So yeah, I think though, absolutely. It's like, to me, what the far right tapped into, and what it, whether that's Brazil, whether that's the US, any of the other countries in Germany, where there is a resurgence of the far right. I mean, first of all, they're just tapping into the same settler colonialism they've always tapped into. But what I think they did was they acknowledged division in some way or another. They acknowledged that everything is not okay. Now, of course, their answer to that, their analysis of why everything's not okay is just to blame Jews and to blame Black people and to essentially just blame already oppressed people. And it's a horrifying conclusion. But in order for the left to counteract that the answer cannot simply be to just say, well, everything is okay. We need to just roll back the clock. Even if the Democrats did win every single seat they were running for all across the country, the far right, these far right, like sort of lone terrorists that we keep seeing, these kind of far right active shooter scenarios, those people are not going to pack up and go home. Something Absolutely. There has been unleashed, and it essentially, to me, I wish we had all day to talk about this. I know we have to wrap up soon. I see this sort of like a feedback loop with kind of this right wing terrorism that then invites an expansion of the state. So when we saw at Charlottesville, one of the complaints coming out of the police department at Charlottesville is like, well, we could have dealt with this problem if we had more of a budget for the police, which is absolutely absurd.
Which is exactly. And that is, I think that speaks to again kind of like the messaging that the Democratic Party specifically, if we're talking just about politics, lacks. I mean, because again, this is not a difficult argument to make when you actually put the effort into making the argument that the reason people are suffering economic depression and have in the past, over the past 30, 40 years, the reason wages have been stagnant over the past 30 to 40 years compared to the cost of living, compared to inflation, is because of these neoliberal policies that have given more and more power and deference to corporations, to businesses, but has treated workers like garbage. And it's like the Democrats in particular don't want to make that message, and it's obvious why, because they get their funding from those very corporations. But then, there are also what's left of kind of the left outside of the Democratic Party. It's like even some on the so-called true left, I guess, aren't really good at making that argument either, because I think there is not a complete or universal understanding of neoliberalism, what it's done. And then there are still these kind of silos, and we see this in the anti-war movement in particular, where you have people who are anti-war, who are anti-imperialist, but they're also very, very focused on making people take pledges of nonviolence. And on the surface, that sounds great, but then when you think about it, that completely eliminates all of the people who are fighting for self-determination and sometimes have to use self-defense to do it. So you've got these older white anti-war activists who were very active in the 60s and the 70s, and they're ideologically, they've got the right focus, but they're not taking into consideration that the silo that they're in regard to pacifism actually leaves out a bunch of people who are being oppressed. So, I mean, there's all of this disconnect from good messaging and historical accuracy and policy that actually is just really just common sense. Like the idea that there's not enough money for social programs is obscene when every year the budget for defense gets increased and passed. So, I mean, how is that a difficult argument for the so-called left party to make? Well, they can't make it when they're voting for the same budget for the Department of Defense, too.
Yeah, and it seems, absolutely. So in our last couple of minutes, I'd like, to just kind of give you a chance to kind of talk about your own project, Luqman Nation, where people can find out more information, basically, about your show, because I think there's so much more analysis there that I wish we had time to get into today that I'd like, people to at least be aware exists.
So you can, I mean, there's so much going on, and there is just this past 2 weeks has been like an overwhelming flood of dear God. Like every day has been like, oh my God, did that just happen? And then you have to sit back and analyze history and go, wait a minute, this isn't new. And I think for us, that's like the overarching issue here in Luqman Nation. We always talk about how none of this is really new. It's just that the people who are actually paying attention to it now and who are experiencing it now, they're new to this. This is not new to us. And if people want to find out more about that, they can find us on Facebook, on YouTube, and on Twitter under Luqman Nation, LUQMANNATION, and just enjoy our content and learn some history. And Brick by Brick, also on Facebook, where we talk about nothing but history. Pit Bulls and Politics. We do a podcast on Spreaker. Usually on Saturday nights every once in a while, but we kind of try to get our message out kind of all over the place. But you can find us on all those platforms under Luqman Nation, LUQMANNATION.
Awesome. Yeah. Thank you very much. I know you have to take off, and we're going to go ahead and wrap up. We've been talking with Jackie and Abdus Luqman, the co-hosts of Luqman Nation, about the kind of rise of the far right. Yeah, especially the kind of events of the past couple of weeks, such as the rise of the far right in Brazil with the election of Bolsonaro. Thank you both very much for coming on.
Oh, thank you
so much.
That's all we have for this week. You've been listening to People's Republic with Brian Griffith. You can find our show on SoundCloud, iTunes, and Stitcher by typing in People's Republic. Or you can follow us on Facebook and Twitter at People's Radio ATX for more news and analysis. Thank you for listening as we report on the global struggle for social and economic justice. We are out of here.